They call it the Great Resignation. But what does that really mean? Odds are you are part of it or know someone who is. But don't be resigned to the Great Resignation. It's a sign of changing times as we examine on this episode of Future Proof.
The future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed. Yet. Today's world teems with innovation. The nexus of hardware, software, and human ingenuity promises a revolution in possibilities. What does tomorrow look like? Witness Future Proof.
Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh here, and very excited to talk about a really hot topic in the business world, folks, the so-called Great Resignation. It is upon us. I mean, scores, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, it's probably in the millions, truth be told, of people are just walking away from their jobs. Why is that? What does it mean? We're going to talk to a couple of experts today. I'm very excited to have Nicole Nebulis on the line from Verint, a company called Verint that does great work in customer experience, but also employee experience. We'll talk about that today. And Katrina Gazarian is the CEO and founder, I believe, of a company called Game Day HR. And so she's really trying to revolutionize the whole HR space, which I think is fantastic news, quite frankly. My history with HR, the first time I heard about what HR is, I was like 15, and I was like, ooh, that doesn't sound good. I don't think I like the sound of this HR stuff. And lo and behold, I became my own boss. And so when you are the boss, you are the HR department until it gets big enough to hire people. But it's a really important role. I think it's a very important role, just like management is very important. And I recall back in the 90s, we had a sort of flattening of the organization. A lot of middle management went away for cost-cutting reasons. And I think we lost some of the art of management, which is really important. But we'll talk about that today in the context of customer and employee experience for the Great Resignation. The key is to use data, use analysis, use all the tools at your disposal to understand what your business is doing, how it impacts your employees, first of all, of course, and also your customers and your prospects. And those are not really separate things. You can do all of that at once if you have the right strategy and you use information to benefit your organization. And so with that, I'll bring in Nicole Nebulis from Verint. Nicole, tell us a bit about yourself and Verint and how you are working to improve experiences and really help mitigate this Great Resignation.
Thank you very much, Eric. So what makes me unique coming to this is that I've been at Verint for about 16 years, and our focus is on customer engagement and employee engagement. But prior to my career at Verint as a consultant from business management, processes, software, and technology, now I do go-to-market strategy. I spent over a decade, starting in the mid to early 90s, in back office operations. And I was one of those non-traditional students that I went right into working in operations at a bank, and it was the wire transfer department. So it was a lot of big money, a lot of strong deadlines. And what we found right away there is when it came to vacation times, I was fighting for those weeks off. And then I moved into the world of consulting and software, and I didn't work in an office again. And it's been working remotely for 16 years. And so when the pandemic came, I was in a role where it went from 100% travel to 30% travel. I was used to being at home, and I've not looked back. I find it so much more productive. So it's very helpful when we start looking at the Great Resignation. I mean, there are certain things I appreciate about that flexibility. If I need to have a doctor's appointment, I'm not trying to take time off of work. I can just take that break in the middle of the day and make up my time. If I need to stay home to care for a loved one, I have a 17-and-a-half-year-old dog. He's elderly, but if I wasn't home, I wouldn't be able to take care of him if I was in the office.
Yeah.
So
No, real quick. I think that you made a couple of really, really interesting points right there. One of which is that when you work from home, when you get that experience, you really have to learn to train yourself and to be disciplined, because you're not in the work environment anymore. You don't have all of these reminders everywhere of who you have to talk to and what you have to do. So you have to discipline yourself. And when you do that, you really get a much greater appreciation for what it means to be part of a team, what it means to take advantage of meetings, for example, that you have scheduled to make sure you get through those bullet points, those whatever they are that you have to cover. So it really puts the onus on you to be more engaged with the people in the office, whether or not you're there or at home, right?
Exactly. And that's why we have focused on a lot of employee engagement. Now, using all the automation that we used to use for operational efficiency, it really comes down to is if you can serve the customer better, you can at the same time alleviate the pressure and provide more flexibility to your employees doing the work. Richard Branson is quoted many times about if you have happy employees, if you focus on your employees, everything else falls into place. And that's true. So I personally, when 5 o'clock comes and my husband is home, I'm putting dinner on the table. I know it sounds old fashioned, but I love to cook. And having traveled and eaten out in restaurants for 7+ years, eating at home's a great thing, but it's that focus on what's important to me and that work-life balance. And that's what I'm seeing, is a lot of the reasons for the Great Resignation. People want to have that flexibility. They want that balance. It's no longer all about work. It's, can I do simple things like have an exercise routine? Can I spend time with my parents? Being able to be there for kids, see them grow up. These things are very meaningful. So
Yes.
to be able to have that flexibility it's no longer a luxury. It's now a requirement. And I think it's a requirement across multiple generations.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point there. And I love that you brought in the quote from Richard Branson, because if you have happy, fulfilled employees, well, guess what? That's going to impact how they treat the people who are your customers or your prospects. So it improves morale. I'm a big believer that morale is the best, is the number one metric basically in any business, in any life. When morale is low, bad things happen. When morale is good, good things happen. And people find ways, right? You can only prescribe so much in terms of behavior of what you should do in this situation, that situation, et cetera. What you really need to do is empower your employees with the information that they need, with the perspective that they need. For example, how this process compares to other processes, or how it is this particular experience would vary from one prospect to another, one customer to another. The more information you can give to your employees that is relevant, that is meaningful, and that is recent, I should throw out there, the better off they're going to be. Right, Nicole?
Exactly. The more you communicate to them, the better off that you are. And what you're not telling them, they're making up their own narrative.
That's right.
So what narrative do you want them to make up, right? Because having worked with many customers, especially when it comes to data and knowing what kind of data managers have and what they can see, they don't necessarily go to the most positive place with that data. So you got to talk to them, you have to reassure them, and you have to have empathy.
That's one of the key words. In a minute here, I'll bring in Katrina as well, but I'll throw another question over to you about empathy. You do have to learn this sort of thing, right? You have to be reminded. I think human beings generally understand what that means, as long as they've got some context around what you mean by empathy. But understanding someone's situation and feeling for them, that's empathy, right? So first you have to understand the situation, then you have to know what to do. And understanding the situation, there are lots of data points that companies collect these days that they can collect to offer a lot of insight about who these people are. And the more attention companies pay to their prospects and to their customers from a programmatic perspective, the more information the call center professional has in front of them, the more information the point of sale person, the register person or whatever has, the better off you're going to be able to treat your customers. And it's a tricky game, because there are lots of APIs that need to be managed. There are lots of technical things that have to come into order to make that happen. But once it happens, that's when and people, I've found, employees are always going to be much more eager to help if they feel they have enough information. Right? Because then they take chances, they'll go out on a limb for the customer, for the prospect, as long as they feel that sort of security. And that's on management, right? That's on management. It's on HR to a certain point, right?
It is, absolutely. And we have to think about, well, what is the employee world like? What, why are they resigning?
Right.
What's declining their morale? So you mentioned two interesting points, the point of sale and somebody in the contact center. The unsung heroes of customer experience are the folks in the back office. If they don't have the knowledge, if they don't have the tools they need to execute, that ends up creating a burden back on other parts of the organization. So, a number of different analysts have said anywhere between 12 and 17% of the contacts coming into your contact center are because of a challenge, either quality or timeliness in operation. So,
Right.
organizations strategically really need to start looking at that end to end. And it almost becomes a not just a competitive differentiator, but a way to help everybody in the organization, you know, have more positive experiences versus dealing with negativity.
Yeah, that's right. And you really hinted on something very important, which is root cause analysis,
Mhm,
right? There are virtuous circles, there are vicious circles that organizations
mhm,
can get into. And if you're in the vicious circle, that's when you got to make some significant change. When you're in a virtuous circle, that's when you
mhm.
need to understand what is working and why is it working. And let's make sure to kind of learn from these best practices and bake that stuff in. But real quick, last comment I'll throw to you before I bring in Katrina here is you also have to watch out for us versus them, right? I've noticed this internally. I've noticed it internally with externals. In other words, people inside the organization to people outside the organization, but also people in departments to people in other departments.
Mhm.
You got to watch out for that us versus them mentality because there's no them. It's only us, and we all have to collaborate somehow to get things done. What do you think about that?
I agree with that 100%. Eric, what I see is very siloed organizations and siloed mentality. And
Hmm.
you can use technology to create consistency and help everybody use the same tools, but you also have to have centers of excellence that then help everybody have very similar conversations. If I
Hmm.
go from, your team to Katrina's team, I need to know, even within we report to the same manager, that the conversation about performance, the conversation about metrics, the way my time off decisions are made and my scheduling flexibility, it needs to be consistent so
Hmm.
that I'm willing to stay. And it isn't about the contact center, say, versus the back office versus a branch. It's us. We're
That's right.
all working on this together. So finger pointing doesn't get us anywhere. Finger
That's right.
pointing doesn't get us to what we need to drive customer experience. And it's one of those very important things. If Varen, every year we produce a study called the Customer Engagement Capacity Gap, and 76% of our respondents said that they believe that their challenges associated with customer engagement and experience is one of those areas that they will be working to do better at over the next 12 months. So I think that this conversation is quite meaningful to what we're discussing today.
Let me bring in Katrina Gazarian here from Game Day HR. I love what you're doing, trying to reinvent HR, trying to make it more empathetic, I'm quite sure, and try to make it where it's more woven into the fabric of the organization. But tell us a bit about yourself and what you're doing, working on this great resignation dilemma that we're facing.
Yeah, hi. I'm Katrina, and just like you said, but so I started Game Day HR about 6 years ago. Just for the mere fact that I didn't like HR whatsoever. I didn't like the connotation that came with HR and this siloed experience. You couldn't be friends with anybody. Essentially, HR had become robots over the last few decades, and when you can't trust your HR department, you ultimately don't really trust the organization. And so I wanted to really push back on this idea that you can't be your full human self, not just in HR, but within an organization, period. And so, we have taglines like HR sucks, and that's just really to get people to talk about HR in a much different way and understand like that, hey, I'm HR, I run an HR company, but I also curse sometimes. And I'm also late sometimes, but I really care about every single person in this organization. So it's less about be friends with nobody and more about be friends with everyone.
I like that.
Make it your responsibility that they're happy and engaged in their position.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's much more in line with, let's call it, team reality, right? I mean, I understand why you have certain protocols in HR because you want to sort of shepherd the behavior and guide people in a certain direction. But any rule that becomes too strict or just too silly, I guess, is going to get ignored, and then it's going to get programmatically ignored, and then you're creating a culture of disconnection in a way. It seems to me. But what do you think?
I agree. And, I consider myself a contrarian or a challenger just, by personality. And I really looked at certain HR rules and did research on them and really presented the information as such and tried to provide a solution to those things. So we obviously just went through a very nerve-wracking political election, presidential election, and this idea that we can't talk about politics in the workplace, it just doesn't, it's not human. And I'm not talking about politics in the sense of here's who you should vote for, but having conversations or at least being able to facilitate conversations. What are you feeling right now? What are your fears if so-and-so wins versus what are your fears if this person wins? And here as an organization, here's what we're going to do regardless. And just really providing some peace to employees about a topic that is very emotional for a lot of people. And so that was an example where we really wanted to let people know it's okay to share how you feel about certain things. Now, can you go and campaign for a candidate? No. But we can have certain discussions. The HR department can facilitate those discussions in a meaningful, engaged way.
I got a good friend who made a really good point one day about the difference between synchronous and asynchronous communication, the difference between in person and over some wire, right? So here on Zoom, what's cool is we can all see each other and kind of gauge reactions. So that's synchronous, and it's more or less in person, even though we're not in the same room. But if you go on email or social media, it's all asynchronous. And so you post something, and at some point later on, someone reads it and they post something. And I've always found that the written word can so easily be misinterpreted. And frankly, I think one of the core reasons why you have all this static, let's call it, in social channels is because it's a combination of things. It's because people are all trying to be funny. They're trying to be clever and witty and sort of sarcastic. And that's very difficult to do in writing, right? Because if you do it in person, if you're talking, you have all these visual and audio clues to go along. Like I'm smiling, I'm clapping you on the back. Then I'm obviously joking around. I'm not trying to insult you. But if it's in writing, and this is something that you have to watch out for, but I'm just kind of throwing out some thoughts there to start the segment. Nicole, I'll bring you in here to comment on these points that Katrina made. I think it's really quite compelling, and we have to pay attention to this, right? So the way you pay attention to it is looking at the data, having honest conversations with your colleagues and with yourself in your mind. I have all those all the time about what this really means, but what are your thoughts, Nicole?
I agree with what Katrina said about values is important. And when you're communicating, you do have to think about what it's like to be in the employee's shoes. So when you're bringing in data, there's desktop analytics is a big thing. And I quite frequently hear that's very big brother-ish. Ooh, it's uncomfortable. Yet we wear the watches, we have the Fitbits, but when it comes to the workplace, and sometimes there is a generational difference, right? But you also have to look at what may have happened in somebody's life outside of the workplace. Does somebody in an authoritarian position make you uncomfortable if you know that much data? So when you as an organization are determining how you're going to have conversations, you really have to get into that intentfully. Also, a lot of frontline leaders, they're in their position because they were really great workers. And that's how I got my first position in management. I was a great worker, but I learned my management skills from watching my dad growing up He was a union painter, so a little bit different than corporate banking. And from the other people that were managers in my department, there was no, hey, let me sit down and teach you some really effective communication manners. Let's think about outcomes and how can I get the best out of my people and use this data. If you think about it, the one thing that we never get taught is that psychological reaction. And if somebody asks you why did you do your work that way? Why were you not on your production system, for half of the day? Mm-hmm. That defensive mechanism gets launched right away. So when you're talking about data, it really needs to be a conversation around, hey, here's our goal. Here's what we want to achieve. How can I help you? Or what kind of things do you think you can do to help the team out? It becomes a very different conversation because when you do invoke that why and that defensiveness, that again, with communication, what's going on in that worker's life outside of work? Are they struggling to make ends meet?
Right.
Do they have a lot of pressure going on? And in the past, it has been, separation of church and state at work. What you do personally does not impact what you do from a work life. And again, as Katrina said, things are changing and we really need to rethink how we're engaging with employees. And I think it goes beyond just the walls of the workplace. It goes beyond how can I provide safety and that retains employees and that drives employee engagement.
Right. No, that's right. That's a very interesting point too. And I'll bring Katrina back in, as I'm thinking about the Great Resignation and why it's happening and what it all means. There are, as I mentioned, lots of forces that come into play. And one of them is just the technology side. There are all these great technologies that we can use, artificial intelligence, machine learning, analytics. That, like we alluded to the process, you have to capture the data, normalize the data to a certain extent, analyze the data, try to understand what it means in a particular context, and then start making some decisions. But the point I'll make here is there's a whole lot more ops going on. And there always was ops. It's just that the ops are changing, right? Like we started with DevOps, where developers work with business operations people on the front line, and that went extremely well. I think it went a long way to kind of tearing down the IT business divide, which was really prominent in the 90s and the aughts, and is kind of fading a bit today with the cloud. But nonetheless, now we're in data ops, marketing ops, ML ops, AI ops, all these. Anytime you hear that ops term, that's work. That's people doing work. And there are lots of different ways to do that work. Yes, you can automate stuff, but there's always going to be some rubber meets road function or process at the end of all that automation that some person does, whether it's interacting with customers, prospects, or whatever the case may be. But it's a wildly different landscape right now, even than it was 5 years ago. The cloud in and of itself is changing things fundamentally. But Katrina, I'll throw it over to you. What I'd like to hear from you is your thoughts on how HR can really facilitate the growth of employees, the growth of people in their career and in their happiness and so forth, using this data by understanding, all right, well, who is this person really? How can I help this person? I think that's the ideal HR director, right? Is someone who's really thinking in terms of proactive nurturing as opposed to reactive discipline. What do you think?
Absolutely. The connotation with HR is that HR is only brought in when something bad is happening, and it's a very reactive mindset. So how do we get HR, the only department that has access to every single employee in an organization, to step in and have very frequent touch points with each employee? And that can be in numerous ways. I think Nicole really hit it when she talked about outcomes. So less about, I think, positions at this point. When we talk about flexibility, I think there's like this assumption in flexibility that, well, you can work whatever hours you want as long as you work like 20 hours, right? And that's the misconception. What flexibility, in my opinion, really means is, okay, here's Nicole's position plan. Here are the 5 outcomes that she's responsible for. The tasks that she has to do to get those outcomes, that's the flexibility. I don't really care what she does as long as it's within, moral company values, as long as she's getting these outcomes, these 4 to 5 outcomes. So that's where the flexibility comes in. So this requires everyone to ask themselves, why am I doing what I'm doing?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're doing certain tasks because you're just being told to do those tasks, you need to ask yourself why, and do those tasks contribute to these outcomes that you're responsible for? So this does two things. This provides flexibility in terms of what an employee is going to be spending their time doing throughout the day. And this also empowers them to have a voice. Mm-hmm. Because if I own employee engagement, that metric is mine. And my responsibility is to improve employee engagement by 10% in Q2, for example. Then if Nicole, who's managing her team, which I doubt she would ever do this because she seems absolutely amazing, but if she's not engaged with her employees, and I realize her department has the lowest engagement of the organization, I'm empowered to have that conversation with her and say, hey, Nicole, listen, I'm responsible for this KPI in the organization. How can we work together to improve the engagement in your department? So you have flexibility in tasks, essentially, and you have empowered voices because they own that single, metric. So I think that's one way that organizations can really start rethinking what employees are doing on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. And then as far as data and technology goes, when we look at all of the information we have access to, we are in data overload. I mean, there's a LinkedIn article here, and then there's something, like managers are being pulled in so many different directions, and they're launching initiatives that have nothing to do with their actual demographic of the team that they're leading. I'll give you an example. A company issues, pet insurance. They want to pay pet insurance for all of their employees. Well, that's fine. But if only 3% of your employees have pets, this isn't really a benefit that is going to be engaging for a lot of employees. So when we talk about data, it's finding out, what do your employees actually want? What do they prefer in terms of benefits and perks and flexibility and hybrid coming back to the office? And so we have this, nobody should be going to the office. Well, you know what? Sometimes going to the office is more mentally healthy for some employees, mm-hmm. whether it's an office that's company sponsored or it's a co-working office, near where they live. But trying to put these like blanket policies or philosophies over the workforce at large really is what I'm seeing happening. It's a workforce. It's not even an organization at large. It's a workforce at large. Then we are not going to stabilize people leaving. And we're not going to see the stabilization of people growing roots anywhere, because quite frankly, people don't know what they want right now as we've all come out of the pandemic changed. Every single one of us, there's not a single person that has stayed the same, going through different things. Some marginal groups affected far differently than others. And so if you want data, ask your employees what they want and what they prefer before launching initiatives.
Right. Ask and you shall receive, right? Don't be afraid to ask open-ended questions too. That's another classic tactic, is ask an open-ended question. So what's going on with you? What are you doing? And then pay attention. That's the key, is to listen to what they're telling you, right? Like there are times when you won't want to listen because they say, well, I think your new program idea is terrible. Oh, really? I thought it was a fantastic idea. But just be honest with people and listen to your people.